Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. This is Words and Numbers, brought to you by James and Anthony. But probably not so much in a week or two. We'll all find out together. Ant, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
I want to revisit a topic that we ran across maybe several months ago, and that is a proposal from the European Commission to standardize all electronic device chargers to USB-C. Let me rewind a little bit. The European Commission is the executive branch of the European Union's government. So basically, this is like our executive branch issuing regulations. Let me read from their press release. Today, the Commission takes an important step against e-waste and consumer inconvenience caused by the prevalence of different incompatible chargers for electronic devices. Years of working with industry on a voluntary approach already brought down the number of mobile phone chargers from 30 to 3, but could not deliver a complete solution.
This is already the dumbest thing I've heard all week.
Well, yeah, and I think the European Commission is misunderstanding something here. First, an unintended consequence, which is when this goes through, and basically it's aimed at Apple's chargers because they're not compatible with USB-C, all of a sudden they're going to create a tremendous amount of e-waste as Apple users across Europe toss out their old chargers and get the new ones.
I don't know about any of this because I have two Apple devices. They're driven entirely by USB-C.
Yeah, you've said that to me before. My wife has an Apple phone. It's never been USB-C. It's some FireWire or something. I don't know what Apple uses.
I walked away from the iPhone years and years ago. Much easier to live my life in the Android world on the phone. And that will, of course, cue the hate mail from all the Apple boys.
They haven't come to a solution because consumers haven't picked one yet. In a free market environment, businesses throw out different sorts of variations on a product, and consumers choose the ones that fit them the best. If you end up with, as Bernie Sanders likes to talk about, 20 different varieties of soap, it's precisely because there is no clear best variety. If there were, that's the one consumers would go for. So
I'm going to head off some hate mail right now and tell you that it was 29 and that it was deodorant.
29 deodorants. What? Yeah. Well, whatever it is, the fact is consumers pick the solution. If one doesn't rise to the top, it's because there is no clear best solution. With a big footnote that assumes that this is a free market where entrepreneurs can come up with new ideas and throw them out there and try different things. Now, here's the thing. When it comes to chargers in the European Union, it's not entirely a free market, because the current system allows Apple to use proprietary charging interfaces. Or in other words, the European Union itself issued a patent to Apple that prevents its competitors from coming out with Apple-compatible devices. Now, if they really want to find the best solution here, they need to step back, remove that protection that they put on Apple, and let businesses try it out. And if indeed Apple's solution is better, everyone will gravitate in that direction.
Here's the thing, right? Think about the last 2 years of your electronic life. I have moved from 3 of every different kind of charger to almost everything in USB-C and maybe 2 other things.
Yeah,
it's already happening. If you just leave people alone, they will arrive at the conclusion they will arrive at.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing, because on the one hand, you can say, well, the European Union can speed up the process by saying, okay, we pick USB-C. But your problem is, how do you know that they've picked the right one?
Right.
Because you haven't left it to consumers to figure out.
And here's the thing. When I buy new things now, and I do buy a lot of electronic things, right? Typically earbuds or headphones. My first question after I figure out if it's a product I want at all is it USB-C compatible? Because that's what I'm trending towards. Everything I own, I want to be on the same standard.
Yeah.
But I don't see why a bureaucrat in Europe should tell me what that standard is.
Yeah, more importantly, I don't know how it is that a bureaucrat in Europe could know what that best standard is. How does he know better than I do what I want?
That's right. And here's what's going to happen. They're going to implement this, and entrepreneurs who are working on alternative products will no longer do it.
That's right. That's absolutely right. There may well be a much better product out there that we're never going to see because the European Union mandated the USB-C.
And I really want to highlight the word never.
If you want a good counterexample to this, Look at how the U.S. handled the transition away from incandescent bulbs. Now, I'm not advocating government intervention in markets, but if you are going to do it, the U.S. kind of did it well. They said, okay, we're going to get rid of incandescent bulbs, and what has to come in its place is something with 25% greater efficiency. And that's it. They didn't mandate what type of bulb. They simply talked about the outcome. We want something that's 25% more efficient, and then left it to the market to figure out what the best way to handle that is.
That was an interesting thing, right? Because I'll stipulate I had no use for what the government held as a first principle. But given that we were going to do that, it was right and best to just back up. And what did you see happen? You saw a flood of products that satisfied the letter of the rule. Companies tried to make new bulbs that looked like the old bulbs because everybody didn't like that fluorescent kind of sterile
the twisty
tone.
thing, right?
It was beyond brutal looking at one, but I have these new things in my house everywhere, and it looks like incandescent lighting everywhere. That's what people wanted. That's what they complained about. That's what they weren't getting. And some genius at some company said, oh, I don't know. Maybe we should give the people what they want.
Right.
I showed up with a giant shopping cart and a handful of money and bought the store out the minute it looked right.
But if the U.S. had done what the European Union is currently doing, it would have said something like, okay, we've got to replace all the incandescents with chlorofluorocarbon bulbs, the twisty things, right? And we would never have had LEDs, which are far superior.
Look, I love incandescent light. I think it's just great. What I don't love is the heat it generates.
Well, you're in Arizona. In Pittsburgh, we welcome the heat.
Yeah. But if you could have told me, look, I've got this product, it'll look exactly the same as the one you've got, and it won't generate any heat at all, I would have bought it on those grounds alone. By the time you tell me about the efficiency of it, I'm already sold. You know, I hesitate to say the government did something well, but the government probably kind of did something well here.
And I want to underline what you said earlier, given that the government is going to do this.
That's right. That's right.
If the way it went about doing it was the best way.
It's a lousy if-then statement because you and I both don't want to give in to the if. But once you get the if, the when naturally follows.
Yep.
And that's as far as I'm ever going to go in complimenting government. Which brings me to my point this weekend, which I think is kind of interesting, and it involves the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell. What do you figure Jerome is up to this week?
Oh, he's got to be talking about inflation. I don't know that the Fed's doing anything other than thinking about inflation.
Indeed, he is. That's exactly what he's doing. And he's got a speech to be delivered on Tuesday. Powell is going to tell everyone that inflation is elevated and will likely remain so in coming months before moderating. As the economy continues to reopen and spending rebounds, we are seeing upward pressure on prices, particularly due to supply bottlenecks in some sectors. These effects have been larger and longer lasting than anticipated, but they will abate, and as they do, inflation is expected to drop back toward our longer run 2% goal. I just want to point your eye to something here because he said inflation, and then he talked about something that's not inflation at all. Bottlenecks in supply chains. That's not inflation.
Inflation's a rise in the average price level. Yeah, there have been bottlenecks, but the bottlenecks are not across the board. They're in specific industries, and so you see those specific prices rising. That's not inflation. If I were to point to one thing going on that is non-monetary that's contributing to inflation, it's the expanded unemployment benefits that encourage so many people not to work. And so you have a reduction in the production of goods and services.
And you probably also want to talk about the overarching $3.5 trillion that the administration is pushing through Congress.
Yeah, how interesting that Powell is not talking about that. Instead, he's talking about supply bottlenecks.
It seems not to come up. I'm happy to leave open the possibility that it will. This isn't the whole speech, but I would be pretty shocked if it did.
The last time I looked, which would have been about 3 weeks ago, inflation since roughly February has been astoundingly high. And by astoundingly high, I mean on an annualized basis, anywhere from 5 to 11%.
This business that Powell is talking about pegs the goal at 2%, which has long been a goal that the Fed has had and achieved.
Yeah, and even 2%, even in the past, is a bit ambitious. Typically, they're in around 2.5%. I mean, they do come down to 1% once in a while.
They come real close. It's not like 11%
No.
happens.
No, I think the average long-term, the average going back to roughly 2000, I believe, is in the neighborhood of 3.4.
Yeah, that seems right, given all the government spending. And frankly, every year with each passing administration, the spending gets higher. Donald Trump said that he would have the United States debt to zero in 8 years.
Yes.
In 4 years, it grew more than it ever did under any other 4-year period. And Biden comes in and says, hold my beer.
I'll tell you a funny story that happened this morning. My MBA students, amongst other things, are reading our book, Cooperation and Coercion, and discussing it in class. And one of the students started talking about our chapter on the debt and quoted us as saying, talking about the debt at 23 trillion. And he turns to me and says, isn't it 28? And I laughed and I said, we wrote this 18 months ago. Over the course of 18 months, it went from 23 to 28.
It's just ridiculous. If 18 months renders an article or a book chapter obsolete, what the hell is going on?
Something has been let loose politically that politicians seem to understand that the voters will tolerate multi-trillion-dollar deficits.
When the voters expect all kinds of funding for the things they like in their daily lives, they will turn a blind eye to any level of debt that's incurred. What could possibly go wrong? Well, just
stick around.
Just stick around for a minute or two, because this one, there's no way to make this right. There will be a massive comeuppance at the end of the day.
There will be. It's going to be amusing, to the extent that these things can be amusing, to see to whom the politicians point. Because the Democrats can't point to Republicans any more than Republicans can point to the Democrats. They're both equally culpable. And I think the voters understand that.
No. All the Trump people said, well, at least he's way better than Obama ever was. All the Biden people say, well, this Trump guy was crazy, but Joe here's okay. They can point their fingers at almost anything without any sort of cognitive dissonance. Which, of course, Ant, brings us to the foolishness of the week. Because, as I often say, that last thing
that wasn't foolish enough.
Foolishness of the week. Federal authorities, and nothing that begins with the word federal authorities ever ends all that well. Federal authorities cash in on safety box seizures. They're going to people's safety deposit boxes and ripping them. They ripped them out of a wall in a Beverly Hills establishment. They made the case, as they cracked open all of the boxes, that the people who had all that money, and it was a lot of money, $86 million in 500 or so boxes, they concluded that anybody who had money there must have been involved in drug running or weapons or trafficking. No proof was needed. They just opened up the boxes, stole the contents, and walked away.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, this is a real game changer, right? Because if you distrust the government enough that you don't want to leave your wealth in something that can be confiscated, you've lost another option.
How did they know there was cash in those safety boxes?
Oh, there's always cash in safety deposit boxes.
This is I mean, it's bad enough that they stop cars and confiscate money, but to drill into a safety deposit box.
Let me read to you a short paragraph from the article, which, incidentally, we will put in the show notes. Prosecutors argued they were within their rights and that the boxes contained weapons and drugs. They also took jewelry, precious metals, and stacks of money to an undisclosed warehouse. Their final haul was worth around $86 million. The problem is that federal authorities took the items from people who hadn't been accused of a crime, and they've been able to keep it up because the country's vague standards of civil forfeiture law, which allows the government to seize property and assets without any actual evidence of criminal wrongdoing. We've actually jumped the shark here because now they're taking things and not even charging people. If the government steals your money and doesn't charge you with the crime, how do you get it back? It's not like you can have a trial. You're just screwed. And for anybody who's watching, you should be very, very concerned with this nonsense.
And this thing has a name. It's called civil asset forfeiture. Check it out.
You and I wrote about this in the Washington Post maybe 3 or 4 years ago. But this was done in Los Angeles, not by the Los Angeles government, not by the ridiculous California government, but by your federal government. Armed with a warrant, FBI and Drug Enforcement Administration agents spent 5 days ripping several hundred safety deposit boxes out of the wall and laying claim to its contents.
Armed with a warrant. Now, that's a twist, because when they stop cars and take cash, there's no warrant involved there. What kind of judge would sign off on this?
Probably any judge at all.
Astounding. Just astounding.
Anybody who's had warrants served on him knows that warrants are very easy for police officers to get. As far as I can tell, judges almost always tell them okay. It's clear, right? Because they shop for the right judge. They know which ones they can call at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon to have a warrant for the weekend.
I'm still stuck on how they knew what was in there, because when you have a safety deposit box, you go in there and you're closed into a locked room. Even the bank doesn't know what you're putting in there.
That's correct. And can't.
Yeah.
Can't know. And you need 2 keys to open it.
Yeah, you have one and the bank has one.
And the banks.
Yeah.
And it has ever been so. And when they put it on the table so you can open it up and deal with its contents, you're as alone as you can be.
Mm-hmm.
There's not like there's cameras there focused on you. It's your box. Go look at it. If you're thinking right now that you want to put something very valuable inside of a safety deposit box, you might want to reconsider.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. This week I want to talk about unions, and this is kind of interesting because I get hate mail on both sides here. On the one hand, I'm happy to say I am extremely pro-union. This is freedom of association. If a group of people get together, they want to form a union, that's perfectly fine. There is no difference between people getting together and forming a union than there is with people getting together and forming a corporation. If one is okay, the other one's okay. However, I draw the line at government-protected monopolies. And it doesn't matter whether it's a government-protected monopoly in the corporate sector or whether the union is a government-protected monopoly. But government protection of the thing is a serious problem. And those two things get conflated because in this country, up until this case that you'll tell us about, right-to-work states versus not right-to-work states. In the not right-to-work state, if you're going to join a company as a worker and the employees at the company are unionized, you are required to join the union as a condition of becoming an employee.
Yeah, that's the part that you can no longer have. Mandatory membership in a union no longer possible. Now, unions are, of course, still allowed to exist and do whatever it is they do. And like you, I think that I'm 100% pro-union as long as nobody's coerced into joining. But the lead up to the 2018 case was that a bunch of people ended up in unions. And I'll cheerfully tell you that I was in 2 different unions when I was younger. And it was a bit of a disaster, right? They would just take money out of my check. They wouldn't do anything for me. And I had no recourse whatsoever. And that's just the kind of thinking that made its way to the Supreme Court. And this ended up being one of our well-liked 5-4 decisions with the conservatives on one side and the liberals on another. And there were 5 conservatives, so now you can't mandate someone join a union. But it's obvious what's going to happen next. What's going to happen next is that we're going to get unions, but with a free rider problem.
Right. People will join as employees, benefit from the contract negotiations and not pay their union dues into the pot.
Right. They won't be in the union, but they will have their job. And when everybody realizes that's what's going to happen, the unions will be defanged almost completely. You've got to ask yourself, which of these 2 outcomes do you want? Do you want unions that force people to join and do all kinds of things? Or do you want unions that can't force people to join and they can't manage to do much of anything?
Right.
Okay, I'm in favor of unions if they're entered freely, and I'm not otherwise, which means definitionally I've got to pick one of those 2 answers, and I would defang the unions immediately because political spending with the unions in this country has always been out of control, and nobody ever bothers to point it out. It's egregious. They're taking money from workers and they're spending it in political ways that the workers would not agree to if they could express their preference. Now, there was always a mechanism by which you can fill out a form and get your political money back. But of course, if you do that, you've outed yourself in your union. So there's really no great answer here. You have to ask yourself, how do your preferences line up? And then how do they line up within the context of American constitutionalism? Because we had 40 or 50 years of unbridled union expenditures. And when I say unbridled, I don't think people realize how much money the unions spend or how they spend it.
You probably have numbers on total spending. I don't have that in front of me. But what I do know is that if you look across industries, look at their political giving, and this is publicly available information, what you find is that industries generally will give, roughly speaking, the same amount to the Democratic Party and Democratic candidates versus Republican Party and Republican candidates. Now, it varies some in the noise. I think the oil industry gives maybe 66% Republican, 33% Democrat, and that's kind of extreme, but most of the rest of them are give pretty close to 50-50. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense because what? They're trying to curry favor with the politicians who are in power. And if you don't know which set of politicians is going to be in power, you donate to both of them. So whichever one's in there, when they're in there, they're going to help you out. So that makes sense. There is a huge exception to that roughly 50-50 rule, and that's labor unions. They give 97% of their money to the Democratic Party and to Democratic candidates. And right there, that tells you there's something strange going on politically with the link between our political system and that particular industry or union.
I suspect if we tried right now to find a human being that was in the John Birch Society and in the Teamsters Union, we'd come up empty.
Right, yeah, exactly.
And that's just how it goes. I have no trouble understanding that whatsoever. I do have a lot of trouble where union members are compelled to do something they don't want. And let me just read you a little bit from Justice Alito, who wrote for the majority in this case. He writes, "We conclude that this arrangement violates the free speech rights of non-members by compelling them to subsidize private speech on matters of substantial public concern." They're hanging it on speech. I'm never convinced that when we talk about free speech, anybody really gets it right. In the end, this is properly a property rights case.
Yes.
You're taking my money. It's properly that. Of course, nobody ever tries a case in that way. Okay, if it's not property rights, it's free association. I opt out of the union. But it's speech. When everything is speech, I guess this is speech too.
And this is an entirely separate topic, but it's interesting. If given the choice of attacking this question from the perspective of property rights or the perspective of free association or the perspective of speech, and they go after speech, what that tells me is that everyone involved understands that the Supreme Court is going to be soft on a variety of rights, but not on that one. And I think that's true. That's where the Supreme Court has consistently come down in defense of the plain words on the piece of paper, in defense of free speech. But they don't do so elsewhere. So it kind of makes sense that everything becomes free speech. It's like with my students, right? If I don't accept late assignments, but I will accept one if your computer crashed, all of a sudden everybody's computer has crashed.
My students always had dead grandparents.
Right, exactly.
I was the slayer of grandparents whenever I handed out some kind of assignment.
And speaking of which, and again, this is another side note. You should all go find James' video podcast. What do you call a video podcast? He's got videos.
Called a video podcast.
A video podcast. Smoking Stories on YouTube. And you should tell the story there about the kid whose father apparently died.
3 times.
Yeah, right. Which is sad from one perspective, but it's an interesting story.
You know, as I look back on it, the first union I was forced into was when I was an employee of the state of Connecticut. Wow, the union was powerful. They sucked out a lot of money from my paycheck, and I had no recourse whatsoever. I remember being floored when I realized how much it was. Now, I had had other jobs prior to that, so I knew all the various taxes that were going to be taken out. But this union fee, my God. It's hard to see how people don't walk away from union life the minute they're able to. Now, I understand that it causes the free rider problem on the other side. But if the unions were actually representative of their membership, they would stay in. If the union was accomplishing the things I needed it to accomplish, I wouldn't go anywhere. But instead, what do the unions do? They funnel all the money right off to Democratic candidates, local, state, federal.
And here's the thing, that free rider problem is not unique to unions. It crops up all over the place in the private sector. And what happens is, if you have a product that is of value, entrepreneurs will figure out how to monetize it, how to get around the free rider problem. So if indeed the union is providing value to people, there's an incentive for entrepreneurs to figure out how to eliminate that free rider problem. Now, you don't have that happening. And I claim you don't have it happening precisely because we have a long history of the government protecting unions. It's much easier to just turn to your politician and say, look, I need laws that will prevent this free rider problem from happening.
And as the labor unions have to figure out how to exist in this new world, I suspect that Republicans are going to start getting some of the money. Because why wouldn't they? All of a sudden, the labor unions are like every other endeavor here in the United States. It's a lot of people dedicated to a common cause. But their preferred party can no longer protect them.
I think one of the criticisms that people will lodge at this topic is to point back to all of the great things that unions did back in the days of horrible working conditions and this sort of thing. And the fact is, I think it is the case that once upon a time, there was a tremendous imbalance of power in favor of employers. And unions arose. They were part of spontaneous order. They spontaneously arose to address that issue, and I think they addressed it well. Perhaps they addressed it so well that we don't need them anymore. And that's why you look in the private sector, only 6% of workers are unionized versus the public sector, 35%.
And that was 2017.
Right.
So 2018 with the case, once that data really starts filtering back in and we can use it sensibly, I know with 100% certainty that we're going to be well shy of 35%. We're going to be more or less down near that 6% figure. It's just going to step down until it reaches some sort of equilibrium. And we see the equilibrium on the private sector side. It's very obviously 6%. It's been 6 or 7% since about 2002.
I want to go back to this idea that had it not been for government protection, unions would have evolved ways of providing more and better value, just the way that businesses have evolved to do so. And I want to throw out a couple of things to think about. One is the health insurance problem. And of course, the health insurance problem, your health insurance is attached to your employer. So if you become sick and you can't do your job, you lose your job and you lose your insurance and you can't get new insurance because you have a pre-existing condition now, right? All of these problems that we talk about. Well, unions could have solved that. Unions could have solved it by becoming the insurers. So here I am, a worker, I sign up with a union, and the union is not attached to my employer. Rather, it represents professors, and I can go anywhere and do my professor thing, and I'm covered by this union, and my health insurance is through them. It would have sidestepped this problem, at least to an extent. Another problem that they could have addressed is this problem we have with the rising cost of higher education. Tuition goes up, and the higher it goes, the more people put pressure on politicians to subsidize higher education, and the subsidization actually causes the price to go higher. Well, look, unions could have stepped into the breach there and said, look, you want an accountant? An accountant doesn't need a 4-year college education. There's 4 semesters of work to become an accountant, and we, the union, will provide that and put a stamp on this person and say, we guarantee this is a good accountant. And if we send this guy to you and he doesn't work out, we will reimburse you in some sense. We'll send you somebody else, whatever it is. But the fact is, the union could have stepped in to become a quasi-higher education industry, training workers in ways that businesses need them trained and then guaranteeing them.
Yeah, but you have to realize the silliness that you're saying right now, because you're describing a state of affairs in which unions would actually be subject to the forces of what their members wanted.
Yeah, and that's the thing. If it weren't for government protection, they would be subject to those members just the same as every other business is subject to its consumers.
Right, and until very recently, unions were nothing but a spoil system. Jobs got passed out to the preferred constituency. Money got passed out to the preferred constituency. And if you weren't the preferred constituency, you could just lump it because it was never going to change, not without some kind of move on the part of the Supreme Court, which we now have. The terrifying thing to me is that people don't know it. I can't imagine why it is, if Americans hate their jobs so much, that they don't latch right onto the idea of unions. What it tells me, and what it should tell everyone, is that they say they hate their jobs a lot more than they actually hate their jobs. Now, there's also the difficulty, if you're a union agitator and it doesn't work out, you're probably going to get fired. Is that legal? No. Is that what's going to happen? Absolutely. So you have to always hedge your bet here. Do Americans hate their jobs? Yeah, I bet a good number of them do. You and I both do some of the time, and we actually like where we work. It's a fluid sort of thing. Do they really hate their jobs? I think the answer is a clear no. I'm told all the time how inhumane Amazon is. Why does anybody work there at all? If it weren't the best option they had, they'd be gone. Now, the best option you have is often not a great option, but it's nonetheless the best option that you have. Who would ever make the case that labor unions really were making their decisions on behalf of their membership and with the best interests of their membership in mind? I just can't see a way that you can make that case.
Well, you talked about unions being a spoil system, so I have an amusing story. I was doing some research, and you and I have picked up that line of research of late on the effect of privatizing Pennsylvania's state store system. The stores that sell alcohol, it's all owned and run by the state here. And for years, I was making this argument, and you can look at the data, that states that have privatized their alcohol industry show lower rates of DUI, lower rates of underage drinking, lower rates of binge drinking. All these things that you would think would get worse with privatization actually gets better. So I've written on this, published both academic articles and op-eds, and I get called to testify on this topic. So I go and I'm saying my thing, and who's in the room but Wendell Young, who is the president of the union that represents the state store workers. He pipes up at the Q&A and says, I want to know how much Davies was paid to write this report. Now, I said, quite honestly, not only was I not paid, I didn't even get gas money for showing up to testify.
Right. That sounds exactly right.
But meanwhile, and this was 10 years ago, Wendell Young was pulling down $350,000 representing the workers in the state store system.
I couldn't wait to point that out.
This is astounding, right? But here's the thing. The state store workers benefit from the existence of the union because there's less competition for the jobs. You can shut out non-union workers, thereby allowing a boost in the wages. In fact, if you look at the data, union workers across the country earn on average 20% more than non-union workers. And what is it? It's simply the union setting up a fiefdom saying we're not allowing anybody in here to compete for these jobs who isn't part of our union. And that benefit filters up, and it filters up to people like Wendell Young making his 10 years ago $350,000.
Geez, wonder what Wendell makes now.
It's enough that every time I have an article, he pops up in the comments saying something snarky about it.
That seems right as well. I wish I had met Wendell. I'd love to hear how a man goes about getting a job like this.
You need a union, James.
Yeah. You have one. You could join the Association of University Professors, which I think is somewhere slightly right of the Politburo, if I'm remembering correctly.
No, we don't have an AAUP chapter at Duquesne, I don't believe.
Go ahead and go start one.
I was years ago member of a union. I was a graduate student in Albany, New York, and some other graduate students outside of my department started a union. And I didn't know anything about unions one way or the other. What I did know was that they were going to take dues out of my paltry paycheck. So I went over and started complaining and saying, where do you get off telling me I have to belong to this union? And clearly I was going to create a stink. They bought me off.
Oh, how sweet is that?
They bought me off. Shortly thereafter, they sent out an announcement saying, if you need travel funds, you can apply to the student union and we will provide you with travel funds. So I applied and within 24 hours was accepted, got far more money from it than they would have been taking out of my paycheck. So they sent me away quiet.
I worked in the SUNY system as well at one of their very bottom of the list institutions. And when I was doing my onboarding, or whatever it is they called it, the union came up and they said, okay, you have no choice, you have to join, but we will provide you with vision benefits. So I added up what I was paying and looked at that against the cost of a pair of glasses, and they weren't doing anything for me. They were just siphoning off the cash. They worked with the assumption that I would put a pair of glasses on and then I'd shut up for the rest of all time.
And again, I want to underline, I don't think the problem is unions. I think the problem is the government protection. They haven't had to come up with innovative ways to provide value to workers. And I'm sure, in fact, I know there are innovative ways they could be providing value. They just haven't had to do that yet. And this may be the case that this Supreme Court ruling actually breathes new life into unions by forcing them to compete like regular businesses.
I suspect that it's all downhill from 2018. They're going to go right down the same hole that we all wished they would go down when it was mandatory.
Well, that's interesting. We're projecting in completely different directions. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out over the next few years.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers, but, we'll be back next week, Wednesday at about noon Eastern time. Until then, you can, play around with us on Twitter like some of you do. Handles are in the show notes. You can join our Words and Numbers Backstage Facebook group where the conversation continues. You can
sponsor us on Patreon at patreon.com/wordsandnumbers and send us email at wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
I'm going to encourage you not to do that last thing. Apparently, I misread something in the Eric Clapton article, and I was beset upon by people.
It was so funny.
who were just, they were smacking me around like we were in a bar fight. But
I got to tell you, whenever you nice people send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com, which you should always do, it goes to both of us. So when you slap James around, I get to laugh and watch the whole transaction.
Yeah, and, when you slap Ant around, I just figure, well, he had that covered. But anyway, we'll see you next week. And until we do, for the love of God, especially you Eric Clapton people, for the love of God, be nice to each other. See you next week, Ant.
See you next week, James.